In this video, we're going to set up a backend server with Node.js that receives a prompt that describes what an image should look like, sends that prompt over to OpenAI, which generates an image URL, and then sends that URL back as the response. To complete this project, you'll first need an OpenAI account. It's a paid service, however, it gives you a free $18 credit to get started, which is more than enough to play around. Now, if you don't want to sign up for OpenAI, you don't really have to follow along with this project. Instead of using OpenAI, you can just use any image URL on the internet to mock or simulate the response we will receive from the API. You'll still learn a lot, it just won't be as fun. Once you've signed up for an OpenAI account, generate a new API key. This key is sensitive and you don't want to expose it publicly, because a hacker could use it to access your account and run up charges. So to use it in our project, we'll set it up as an environment variable. Create a .env file in the root of your project, then create a key called OpenAI that is equal to the API key. What we want to avoid here is including the key in a public Git repository. So we'll want to make sure this .env file is included in the gitignore file as well. Now that that's taken care of, we can start building our server. First, we'll need to install some dependencies. We have .env, which will be used to access the environment variable we just set up, as well as Express.js and Course to build a RESTful API. And lastly, we have the OpenAI SDK that we can use to make requests to OpenAI. Now the entirety of our server-side code will be handled in the server.js file. At the top of the file, we'll first want to import .env, then call .env-config. What this does is allow us to access the environment variables that we defined in that .env file. Now we'll use those environment variables in the next step, when we initialize the OpenAI SDK. We'll first create a configuration object which requires the API key. We can access the API key by calling process.env.openai. And then finally, we use that configuration to initialize the OpenAI SDK. And now we can bring in Express.js, which is an extremely popular and minimal framework for building web applications in Node.js. The cool thing about Express is that when a request comes in, we can apply middleware, which is some code that will run on every single request. Most importantly, we want to bring in a library called CORS. It stands for Cross-Origin Resource Sharing, which is a security mechanism, but that's beyond the scope of this video. I have a 100-second video if you want to learn more. Now, the other piece of middleware that we'll want to use here is express.json. This tells our API that it only wants to handle incoming data in a JSON format. There are all kinds of different data formats that can be transmitted over HTTP, but for an API like this, JSON is the most common format. Now that we have our middleware configured, we can create our first endpoint. We'll first need to choose an HTTP method like get, post, patch, etc. In this case, post is the best option because we're creating a new piece of data. This method takes two arguments. The first argument is a string that represents the URL of the API. In this case, I'm going to use a URL which we'll navigate to in a few minutes. Then the second argument is a callback function that has a request and response object that we can interact with. This callback function will be called every time someone navigates to this URL. Also notice how I'm using the async keyword here to make this an async function. Inside the function body, I want to access the prompt or the description of the image that the user is trying to generate. Once we have that data, we can then pass it off to the OpenAI API by calling the createImage method and passing that prompt as an argument. It also has an argument for the number of images that you want to generate, as well as the resolution. Using await on this call will pause the execution of this function until OpenAI is finished, which will probably take a couple seconds, and then when it's done, it will give us a response object that contains the image URL. Now that we have the URL available, we need to send it back to the client as a response. And we do that by calling the send method on the response object. The client or browser will then receive this data as JSON. That takes care of the code for our API endpoint. The final thing we need to do is fire up the server. We can do that by calling app listen, followed by the port that you want to use. When running this locally, it will serve on localhost 8080. And you can optionally pass a callback here to let you know when it's ready. Now at this point, we should be able to fire it up by opening up the terminal and running node server.js. We now have a running server. In the next video, I'll show you how to use a REST client to test it out before we get into the front-end code.